podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, Associate Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Paul Edgar, sits down with two distinguished senior fellows from the center, retired Marine General Robert Neller, the former 37th Commandant of the Marine Corp, and retired Army General Vincent Brooks, former Commander of U.S. Forces Korea. Edgar, Brooks, and Neller discuss the contribution of the military to support civic authorities as they respond to the COVID-19 crisis. They discuss both the organization and structure under which the military forces respond, as well as the capabilities the military is capable of providing in order to augment the response of local authorities. They also discuss a bit how this contributes to the larger questions of globalization and the worldview that accompany issues associated with reevaluating strategy in the wake of COVID. Let's listen in on their conversation.
Hi, my name is Paul Edgar. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin, and this is Horns of a Dilemma. Our guests today, we have our Clements Center Distinguished Senior Fellows, U.S. Army General retired Vince Brooks, former Commander of U.S. Forces Korea, and Marine General retired Robert Neller, the 37th Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming here to Horns of a Dilemma, taking time to talk to us. I hope you and your families are holding up well under the current circumstances. So today, General Neller and General Brooks are going to share some of their experiences and expertise with one of the U.S. military's less frequent roles. I'm going to introduce our theme with a recent quote from the actor Sean Penn. Now he's been pilloried for these comments, but at the same time, there's some substance in them that we'd like to get at. And Sean Penn has seen the military do some good humanitarian work in Haiti, perhaps other places, and that substantive part of his sentiments is what we'd like to explore today. So to quote Sean Penn, there is no greater humanitarian force on the planet than the United States military. The logistical skills, commitment to service, their care for the people, it's really time to give the military the full breadth, command, and control of this operation. When you have a massive logistical force with that kind of training, with those kinds of resources available, these people understand America and what it's about. I wouldn't blink. I would have put command and control in their hands a month ago, certainly today. Now, I think we all agree that the military ought not be in charge of the U.S. response, and that's, I think, largely what Penn was pilloried for. But at the same time, we can look a little harder at what the military can offer or is offering at a moment like this. And if we can appreciate what is behind those comments, we might quote another actor of his era. And I'm not sure if I can do a good Nicolas Cage impression, but really that's high praise for the military. So gentlemen, sometimes we hear members of the military mention the mission support to civil authorities, and there's probably many other terms that might be included in that or separate from that cover the same or similar material, the same or similar roles or missions. What is that, and what does it entail? What does it look like on the ground? Why don't we start with you, General Brooks?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, what a timely topic for us to go into. I really appreciate being part of it. I do have to challenge first one of your thoughts about it being a less frequent. This is actually a very frequent mission for the military, domestically and overseas as well, given the number of natural disasters that we see happening around the world and even happening in the 50 states and territories of the United States. So the organizations who are involved in this are involved in it frequently, multiple times in a given year. It becomes much more visible when you have a situation like we have right now with COVID. But really the bottom line to it is there is a mechanism for the broader term called defense support to civil authorities, which means that military or Defense Department capabilities can be committed in support of civil authorities, beginning with federal civil authorities and in some cases being passed in support of state and local civil authorities as well. So that's really what it is. It's a system and a structure with established procedures and organizations with responsibilities to be able to do that.
What does it look like on the ground? How do those capabilities plug into I know it'll probably be different in every circumstance, but maybe you could give us an example of what it would look like for those capabilities, those units or people to plug into civil authorities.
Well, you're right, Paul. It is different for each circumstance. So a hurricane response in Florida is going to be different than a hurricane response in Texas. An oil spill in the Gulf Coast is going to be different than an earthquake response in California. Each one of these will be somewhat different. And clearly we have a very different circumstance with COVID. There are several things that are going to be commonplace, and that is the structure for command and control of those defense forces. The military has a built-in command and control structure and system. There's a hierarchy, there are organizations, there are headquarters, there's leadership, there are communication systems, and they have subunits that can be moved to the place where an incident requires presence. And they bring their own life support, they bring their own communications, and sometimes that's the first and most important thing that goes in is a system of communication. But there are also, very importantly, liaisons who come from the Defense Department. Sometimes they're emergency procedure liaison officers who tie directly in with the civil authorities receiving support. Generally, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, that has the lead agency responsibility for U.S. government. And those liaisons tie in with them and lower levels of government to provide support like you're seeing happening right now. So there's liaison all over the place with the governor of New York or with the governor of Oregon, Washington State, et cetera, all 50 states and 5 territories to make this connection.
General Neller, what about you? What are your thoughts and experiences with this sort of mission set?
Well, as General Brooks said, this is not an uncommon thing. Go back to 9/11, and we have established the NORTHCOM. The NORTHCOM commander is currently General Shaughnessy, so he is the lead within the DoD through the Secretary of Defense to provide, capabilities. Now, he doesn't have any assigned forces. He has to have forces allocated to him, like he does now on the southern border of the United States, where you've got Army and Marine Corp forces down there and supporting Homeland Security and border customs and border.
Right.
So that's an example. So the way it starts domestically is there's a request that it comes through to the Secretary of Defense, and what the military wants to know is like, okay, what do you want me to do? What are the capabilities that you need? What problem do you want me to help you solve? In the COVID situation, what we have right now is you've had Army Corps of Engineers out there building a lot of expeditionary hospitals, setting up hospital capability within existing hard stand. You've had all sorts of medical capability, particularly the most visible or the Comfort and the Mercy in Los Angeles and New York, but I'm sure there's other military medical capabilities that are there in the Army and the Air Force. The Marine Corps doesn't have. Marine Corps relies on the Navy for its medical support. But there'll be a request that will come in to the Department of Defense, be actioned through the Joint Staff, and then there'll be a determination on what's the best capability to do that, and then you have to figure out, how you're going to get there. And normally these things don't come with any funding. So there's a resource price to this, or in this case, and that it's really not an issue or concern, but there's got to be resources to activate the people if they're from the reserve component, or if they're National Guard, you got to pay their salary. The governors, there's a chain of command process, particularly in a natural disaster like a hurricane, where the governor has the National Guard, and you've got maybe other federal military, and they're reporting to a civilian leader, whether it be FEMA or somebody working through the state or the region. So, this is something, it's somewhat complicated, but it happens enough where there's people that really understand how to do it. And what it looks like on the ground is it looks like uniformed military people providing support, whether in a hurricane, it's airlift or evacuation, as you saw in Texas with the Coast Guard and other agencies. You had a lot of forces down in Puerto Rico. We had an entire Marine Expeditionary Unit and Navy Amphibious Ready Group get taken out of their training cycle to spend a bunch of time down there to support that, along with all the other joint forces that were flying in, people and equipment and engineering to clear the roads, people to help with distribution and logistics and transportation. So those capabilities are all part and parcel of a military organization. So there's great utility if there's a requirement for them to augment civil agencies.
Right, and I think it's important sometimes for us to realize that FEMA, other organizations, perhaps CDC, they don't have the really enormous logistical infrastructure or capabilities that the military does. So all of these things are all of a sudden, under the right circumstances, placed at the disposal of organizations that don't normally have physical capacities to provide emergency services, or to at least to provide some structure to an emergency and start sorting it out. General Brooks, you mentioned the jointness of these missions. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also, since your expertise coming up through the ranks in the Army, can you talk a little bit about what the Army in particular has to offer?
I think it's really important to understand that while the services each have different capacities for a given circumstance, the way we organize to do our work throughout the world, and now also since 9/11 in the United States and the territories, is through joint commands. So that's who exercises the control of any forces that are committed to a particular mission. Beneath them, we also organize joint task forces. These are ad hoc organizations, usually built around some existing headquarters, like an Army headquarters. 5th Army, for example, out of San Antonio, Texas, is the Army component of U.S. Northern Command, as General Neller mentioned, commanded by General O'Shaughnessy right now. And they have responsibility for organizing responses in the 50 states and territories. And so you have this structure that is in place that lets organizations fall in underneath of them. In some cases, there's a necessary separation between the National Guard and the federal. And that's very important in situations like this. And the law establishes two different authorities under which they can work. The National Guard can work under state authority or underneath the federal authority, or said differently, Title 32 and Title 50, which is two different authority, or Title 10, which is a different authority. And what's important here is that the states have control of their National Guard forces unless that control is taken away by the federal government. And in a situation like this, we find that it's better to leave them under the control of the state governments, but they will coordinate with U.S. Northern Command and with those components. So all these organizations then come underneath of it, and we start seeing things being applied in interesting and creative ways. Back to your question about what does it look like on the ground? It might be National Guard troops from the National Guard of the state of New York establishing screening sites outside of a medical facility so that someone who needs screening or even prescriptions can have that done without ever having to walk in to an emergency room and increasing the pressure. That's military, medical, and units that are conducting that kind of work. But there will also be Army Reserve units, for example, that can be augmenting different aspects of what's happening in a disaster. I'll give you one example of what's happening right now. The United States Army Reserve has the ability to organize what has been titled Urban Augmentation Medical Task Forces. These are groups of 85 people, 85 medical practitioners. All of them are reservists. They're from the Army Reserve, brought into federal service and committed somewhere. 6 of these task forces, for example, have been sent to the city of New York. And each one of them is the equivalent of a hospital staff for a 250-person or 250-bed hospital. So you have a modular medical team that can run a hospital of 250 beds on arrival, being inserted in 6 of those in New York, 3 of them to New Jersey, 1 of them in Connecticut, and 2 more to Massachusetts, 1 to Pennsylvania. This is the kind of depth that exists in our reserve forces, and they will be committed by Northern Command. So there's a joint headquarters that commits them, and then may put them into subordination in a given geographic area under another lead, and it'll be the federal military lead in a given area in support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So FEMA is always the lead. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the joint approach. All services will provide capabilities that have been asked for, and then they move underneath of a single command structure in place, and then provide that support through that single command structure to FEMA. It works really well. One of the hardest things to do in a crisis is to get organized. And when you commit military organizations with this kind of a construct, there's already organization. So that part of it is less of an issue. I mean, there's friction, obviously, but it's less of an issue than it would be if you were trying to start from scratch.
General Neller, we were talking a little bit earlier about during Hurricane Sandy, and in New Jersey, I worked with a Marine engineer unit that was responding to a lot of the problems that were occurring, I think, at Sandy Point in New Jersey. Have you, as a Marine or in a joint assignment, have experience in personal experience in support to civil authorities, and what was it like?
I have not personally been involved in an operation in support to civil authorities also, but I've been in the chain of command where, for example, response to Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast particularly hard, New Orleans, where ironically, it was the headquarters for Marine Forces Reserve, which is the component, as General Brooks mentioned, 5th Army in San Antonio is the Army component to North. Mar 4 Res in New Orleans is the Marine component to NORTHCOM. And NORTHCOM was, I think, just barely stood up after 9/11. And so their ability to do things was limited because they had to evacuate. And they had, just like not to the scope and scale of the Army Reserve or the Guard, there's about 39,000 Marine Reserve units in about 160 spots around the country. And some of them are aviation, some of them are engineers, some are ground combat, some are logistics. But the headquarters actually had to evacuate. So their ability to respond to that, it ended up being an active duty force that drove down from the East Coast or sailed around on board ship and came in across with the Navy and coordinated. And as General Brooks said, I mean, I remember General Honore, who was kind of the voice of the federal response down there and did a great job leading everybody and keeping everybody focused on the mission and disciplined. But at some, we're all working for the governor of Louisiana or whoever it is in the federal response or FEMA. So I remember that. I remember Sandy. I remember when it happened. I was actually at North Carolina at a meeting, and I told the guys there, I said, "Hey, you guys better, this hurricane's going up there, you better get ready to get on ship." And the Marine Corps had actually pre-positioned some ground engineer equipment up at Norfolk because the naval component to NORTHCOM is Fleet Forces Command, which is headquartered in Norfolk. So after a while, we realized we had a kind of a spate of hurricanes, and there was a need for power, clean water, distribution, transportation, engineering equipment. So we pre-staged a small equipment set up there to get them quickly on ship and get them underway. And so you could go on and on and on. I remember Sandy. I remember the Marines came up on ship. They kind of followed the storm up the coast, and they came in, did some debris removal and did some other things. And, again, tried to find a place where they could help and coordinate their activities with the state and local authorities and the other joint forces that were descending upon the scene. So whether it's Hurricane Harvey in Texas, whether it's the hurricanes that hit the Caribbean a couple of years ago, whether it's the COVID event, whether it's earthquake in California, the joint force has a capability to facilitate the response. And there is a command and control, but it kind of can get a little bit cumbersome, but there's a way to work through it. And as General Brooks said, the key is to establish liaisons throughout the chain of command, both on the civil and the military side, so everybody knows what's going on, and there's good communication or crosstalk, and we don't get in other people's way, and we're there to do what we really need to do, which is to alleviate any suffering or fix things to get the local community back on its feet and recover from whatever it is. This COVID thing is a little bit different because it's pretty much a medical thing, although there is a big logistical piece with trying to move the PPE and distribute things and how to coordinate that. And again, this is you could call it a black swan event, but I think there'll be a lot of lessons learned, even though we've war gamed the military and the government has war gamed these type of things before. Until you actually do it, something of this scope and scale, it's pretty. There'll be a lot of lessons learned, and hopefully, if this happens again, God forbid, there'll be a little better readiness or preparedness to respond in a more rapid and an efficient manner.
Right.
General Neller brought up a really important point about some of the logistics capabilities that exist, and I want to comment on that. There are things that happen from this category of defense support to civil authorities that will not be as visible as a checkpoint outside of a hospital with people in uniform. So those will be very visible. Or a Corps of Engineers assessment team going through a hospital. And by the way, they've done some remarkable work in terms of that. All 50 states, all 5 territories, with some nearly 1,000 assessments being done of different facilities in the span of less than 30 days. So you see this kind of thing happening. But on the logistics side, when a federal emergency is declared, FEMA has to turn to somebody to get things. And in many cases, particularly now with the Defense Production Act being activated in several cases, the Defense Logistics Agency becomes the primary contingency contractor. It is the one that moves the money to someone who can get a job done. So, for example, there was a recent contract awarded for 60 mobile sterilizer systems, and each one of these mobile sterilizers can sterilize 34 million masks, these N95 masks, 34 million of them in a week, allowing them to be used 20 times. And so when you have a logistics challenge of getting more masks, things like this can also be critical. Well, it's the Federal Emergency Management Agency that ordered the contract, and it ended up going to the Battelle Company in Ohio. But it's the Defense Logistics Agency that makes the contract and moves the money, and then ends up enabling the delivery of these systems. And so we can't ignore the robustness that comes when there is a federal emergency and the Department of Defense is committed. It adds depth and breadth and scope that is not otherwise available, especially when you have something that's affecting all 50 states and 5 territories.
Right. And that translates into speed, which is obviously a necessity, especially at a point like this.
Sure. I mean, it's a matter of once the Department of Defense gets the order, then existing structures like the Defense Logistics Agency change their mission, and they simply turn and begin doing work on that instead of sustaining forces overseas. By the way, that doesn't stop. So they have to still take care of their day job, but they turn to the problem. And all of our defense forces do that when called.
One of the things that I think the impression that listeners can take away, and in particular, I may not be thinking of our average listener, but some of our undergraduates here at the University of Texas, I know some of them had a question about this exact thing back in February. We were just discussing it. But the impression they should take away is that this is not martial law or military dictatorship. This is really helpful, wanted, critical assistance to people who know what they're doing, need it, and know how to implement it. What generally is the public response or the response of civil authorities who've received this kind of help? General Brooks, why don't we start with you?
Well, in my experience, and I back to the question of firsthand experience on it, I'm not an on the ground distribute something during a crisis experienced person, but I am experienced with organizing response forces for domestic support as well as international support in several areas of the world. And it's this approach that is in response to someone's request that fundamentally causes them to be appreciative. And then how well the committed forces do once they get there to alleviate suffering first and to simplify the provision of support to those who are in desperate need, including making it easier for governments to get the work done of taking care of their constituencies. I've always found them to be greatly appreciative. Now, if we get into a situation where bureaucracy hinders us, and sometimes that can happen. I recall as I was in the Pentagon during the Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita incidents, and bureaucracy and a bit of territoriality began to emerge in the process. So the federal government would respond, but not until the states made the request, because they didn't have authority to just impose themselves at that point in time. Some states were fast, some states were slow. Blame began to move as a result of that. And so we see these frictions that come in. But for the most part, for those beneficiaries of support, and that's people who are suffering and governments who are in need of assistance, I've seen nearly universal appreciation for what it is the military can bring to bear.
Right. What about you, General Neller? What have you seen as the public response or the response of civil authorities to this sort of help?
Well, like as General Brooks said, this is based on a request, and the same thing applies to overseas. We don't go into the sovereign territory of a foreign country without their express request for our support. But and the same thing goes here with the states, and we aren't going to put a federal force inside a state without the governor's approval or authority, because we're there to support them. But the response is almost universally, as long as we're there and we know what we're going to do. And your military, our military, not my military, it's our military. We have a bias for action. So when we show up and we're there, we want to help, we want to do stuff. People pitch in, whether it's with their bare hands to move debris or helping people move across the street, or tell me what you want me to do, or they have a natural sense of initiative and an aggressive mission accomplishment. They're going to go out there and do stuff, and people see that and they appreciate that there's a bias for action, and the military of the United States is made up of great young men and women, and they want to go out there and make stuff happen, and they want to help people. And there can always be a certain amount of, well, we haven't been asked yet. I remember at Camp Lejeune at the turn of right around 2000, 2001, there was a hurricane, and the roads were cut off, and we were actually on the base, but we knew there was a requirement and need for help. So we had amphibian vehicles. So we went out and started to do rescues because we could move about and help people, and we coordinated. We weren't trying to get in anybody else's business, but you can sit there to a certain point and go, hey, look, I got to do something. I got to make something happen because I can see, or I'm aware of what's going on, or people are stuck, they're stranded, they need food, they need to be rescued, they need to be taken to the hospital, and I've got the capability to do that. So as General Brooks said, every service has unique capabilities, things they can do. But to answer your question, I believe domestically and internationally, when the U.S. military shows up, the response is almost 100% of the time great appreciation and respect and acknowledgement that we have a great force.
Right. Very good. Thanks. That's been my experience as well. Probably the biggest experience I had was helping out with Hurricane Sandy, and the manner in which we worked with local authorities, the manner in which we worked with the public. It was all a positive experience, I think, for everybody all around. They were grateful for the help, and we were very happy to help them. All right, General Brooks, you mentioned that there are several other things that are worth considering, several other perhaps capabilities or details of this mission set that you think are worth talking about and knowing.
Well, it's just I could go on and on about the depth of what can be and is being committed in this case with the COVID response. And as I mentioned before, each response is different depending on what's of value at the point in time. But under the present circumstance, there are things like medical research and development and centers for infectious disease evaluation. The U.S. Army's got a structure for that, uniquely structured to have depth to look into researching infectious diseases. They are part of the solution on finding the nature of this particular virus and counters to it. And that's the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, or USAMRID as it's often called. The Walter Reed Medical Institute for Research, the United States Army Medical Research and Development Command. All of these things are structures that you won't see standing out in front of a location where people are sick, but they're part of what brings about the solution and brings an end to the suffering. And so there are pieces like this that I think are very important. And very visibly right now, we have the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and they play a unique role, not as an Army force per se, which they are, but they really are the nation's engineering force, and can be called in to do things like restore power on the island of Saipan in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, as was done in response to a typhoon in the summer of 2015. A joint response, but that was one of the capabilities that they were able to bring to bear. We also have organizations that are all over the place before the crisis begins. So they're already in place when something happens. We talked about Hurricane Sandy and what happened along the eastern seaboard. There was already a joint force headquarters for the National Capital Region, but it has a very large geographic area and could immediately be assigned the role as the Joint Task Force headquarters and provide the command and control. The Corps of Engineers has divisions that are all over the country and with responsibilities in some cases abroad as well. Those provide immediate authority to plug in with a governor or governors because they have a multi-state area, and that has happened. So when in New York, for example, Governor Cuomo is calling for the Corps of Engineers, it's the division commander for the Corps of Engineers in that region that has from essentially the border between Virginia and North Carolina all the way up to Maine. That's who responds right away and has been on the ground with the designs to build out all these hospital facilities. So I guess my point here is that there is a extremely large depth that is sometimes not seen, but is always engaged in trying to solve these problems. And it adds to the federal response in a significant way.
All right. Well, thank you for the information and details that even those of us who have served don't know about. Let's transition just a little bit to talk more about the role of the National Guard versus the active component in an event like this, or perhaps something similar. General Brooks, how do you view, or how do you explain the difference in the authorities and roles of the National Guard and the active component in an emergency or crisis?
Well, they're the home team. When something happens, the Guard is already there and is also directly affected by it. So if something happens in the Gulf Coast, the National Guard for those states, they and their families are also affected, and yet they will always respond to the call of their governors and, if needed, to the federal government to move to the scene where help is needed. And they'll be among the very first that you'll see out there. So they're almost like an extra layer of first responders. And given the National Guard having unique authorities while it's under state control, if need be, it can add to law enforcement. Only the National Guard can do that when it's in a state status. They can add to law enforcement. So in other words, they provide local support to civil authorities, and the law enforcement agencies at local level would be those civil authorities. That's something the federal government does not engage in. There's an act that limits that, the Posse Comitatus Act. While it is possible, it generally is not done and isn't needed to be done because we have National Guard. Similarly, the National Guard can be federalized, so they can be brought to federal service as they were during the response to 9/11, particularly the air arms of the National Guard, flying air caps over top of the nation's capital or in the Midland of the United States or up on the northern tier. Very, very important. So they're a very flexible force that let us respond to things immediately in the homeland. When it comes to moving them from state to state, that requires federal action and requires engagement between governors and with the federal government as well to do that. A bit more complicated, but certainly possible. And we may have seen some of that happening now. And then the last part, of course, is when we look at the federal, we don't always think about the reserve forces. And General Neller mentioned the Marine Reserve Command and how important it is to responding in the homeland. The U.S. Army Reserve, for example, has a lot of unique capabilities in it, like these medical teams that I talked about. And they can be brought to bear as well under federal control to provide a response that's very different. So each one of these aspects, the traditional active force can respond to things like a force that's at a training event that's in the right place and is diverted immediately to provide relief and support, or can be sent to other places. I mean, there's some 4,000 military doctors and nurses who have been committed just to New York City. 4,000. And so it's the ability to move to the need that the military components bring: Guard, Reserve, and Active, all three of them.
Now, both of you have touched on this a little bit, but perhaps let's take another minute to share with our listeners more about what you know the military is doing right now in the COVID crisis. And General Neller, you mentioned a little bit before, but could you expand on some of the things you know Marines or other parts of the military are doing now to support civil authorities?
Well, I was listening to General Brooks. I mean, I don't think most people understand the scope and scale and size of the United States Army. And you have the active Army, which is like around 450,000 soldiers and another 200,000 civilians, and you've got a Guard and a Reserve Force. I mean, you almost have 1 million people that are capable, trained, committed to doing whatever they have to do in defense of the nation. And the Marine Corps Reserve is only at 39,000. There is no Naval Guard equivalent like you've got Air Guard and Air Reserve that make up the home team for Homeland Security. So it's a great, feeling to know that you've got this huge capability, this huge strategic reservoir of talent and skills. And as he was talking about the medical thing, he mentioned Walter Reed. I mean, in the infectious diseases, let's not forget that it was Walter Reed and Dr. Gorgas who figured out that, the yellow fever was caused, yellow fever down in Panama, which a lot of the connectivity built, were Army doctors, and they did that. So the Army has this great history of working on medical problems and helping keep the force safe and healthy, and then transferring all that knowledge to the civilian side. So I have not seen, just a couple of thoughts on the use of Guard or Reserve. These individuals have day jobs. They're police officers, they're first responders, they're firemen, they're maybe working in a hospital. They're doing something, and for them to be mobilized and activated, they have to be taken out of that job to go do the job that they have signed up to do in the Guard and the Reserve. And that becomes particularly problematic in a disaster when they're the home team, but yet their home may have been destroyed or their family disrupted. So all those things have to be taken into account when you activate and mobilize these forces. With the COVID, it's a little bit different. I have not seen, I haven't seen any Marine Reserve units get activated. I know that some Marine units have deployed to different places overseas. I saw some go to Guam to help with some support there at the naval base. But I think the majority of the stuff that I've seen has been Army, Navy, Air Force medical teams, either on ship or in hospitals or field hospitals, set up and do those things and assist with some distribution. I think right now most Marine units are are trying to maintain good health and maintain their readiness, because the rest of the world is not going to quit.
Right. Doesn't wait.
There's other, in General Brooks's old neighborhood, his good friend is over there doing some provocative acts, and other countries in the Middle East continue to do the things that they do to disrupt what we would consider to be civil behavior in the international scene. So, but I think we should all be proud of all the things that the force has done, particularly our medical teams, as was mentioned, and all the Guard personnel that are out there doing the things that they need to do to either spell civil or civilian agencies or to augment them and make them more effective.
Great. Well, thank you. Are there any other units that you think are worth highlighting right now that are involved in this particular fight?
Well, I really want to just emphasize the fact that was just made. The world does not wait. In fact, there are clearly indications of adventurism.
Right.
Different entities trying to test the ability of the United States to handle this crisis, given our numbers and the visibility of our numbers globally, and also to attend to its frontiers. And so our military forces remain alert on that and are still active. And we see something like the carrier Theodore Roosevelt having a significant medical issue itself. That affects the readiness of the entire force. That affects the cycling of aircraft carriers, and those are limited in number. And so whether it's the provocative missile launches and demonstrations that we've seen in North Korea, or the close run that was done in the Arabian Gulf by Iranian fast attack craft a few days ago, or within the last few days, or whether it's Chinese aircraft carriers moving near Japanese waters, which we've seen also in the last week. So there's a lot of other activity that happens beyond what perhaps meets the headline news, which is appropriately focused on the COVID impacts. But the Defense Department doesn't get to look only at one thing. It has to continuously remain engaged globally. And the last thing I would say about that is we have forces deployed in hundreds of countries around the world. And for those forces in nearly every country, and perhaps it would be safe to say in every country where they're located, there's also a COVID problem going on. And so they first have to protect themselves, and commanders are doing, I think, great work to try to protect their own force. But they also provide assistance and support right outside of their gates and to the country where they're located to the extent that they can. And so I know that's the case where I came from in Korea last time. I know that's the case in Italy, as we saw such a rapid rise in cases there, but there's a U.S. military presence there, and they provided some assistance to Italian authorities as well. So I guess my point here is that while the concentration and the discussion today is about response to COVID, that's not the limit of what your military is doing on a day-to-day basis. They remain engaged around the world, and something I think we can all be pretty proud of.
That's actually a good way to transition to the next topic of discussion, and that's mill-to-mill relationships in times of crisis. We think of this, if we think of this only as a national crisis, we're wrong, right? This is an international crisis, and there's lots of discussion about whether this is a moment that sort of proves realism or isolationism. We have to look out for ourselves almost exclusively, right? But others are claiming that the moment really proves the value of internationalism, that more engagement, deeper engagement would have led to earlier warning, less spread of the virus, global coordinated preparation. How can our relationships with foreign militaries, often, again, referred to as mill-to-mill relations, shed light on this kind of debate? This is an interesting question because militaries exist to defend their country, right? Their own people. They're nationalist by nature to a certain extent. But militaries are also a form of diplomatic relationships. So they're also internationalist by nature. So how can these relationships shed light on this sort of debate? What do they contribute to responding to an international crisis? And General Brooks, we'll start with you again this time and come back around to General Neller.
Well, I would say that certainly a case can be made by either side, those who think that we should just be focused on ourselves and those who think that our presence abroad makes a difference for our nation, and that's part of our defense. And so I won't engage in the debate on which of those is appropriate. I have my own views on it, but I think what's more relevant here is that there are indeed relationships around the world because of our presence, because of standing shoulder to shoulder or side by side with someone, and sometimes short years, in other cases for many decades. And that does matter. And so I have watched what's happened in Korea and the relationship between the U.S. forces there and the South Korean government. It's been very important to both. And some of the lessons learned on how South Korea bent the curve will be transmitted first by the military organizations who are right there, as well as through embassies. But our military presence tends to be a much more robust connection to countries than our diplomatic presence. And this is not to belittle in any way the importance of diplomacy, but rather to say that where we are located, we tend to have a whole lot more people we can commit to connecting to another country. And that's very important for us. And even the approach to exercises that we do. When I was the commander of U.S. Army forces in the Pacific, right before I went to Korea, the primary focus that we concentrate on throughout the region was humanitarian assistance and disaster response. That was the bread and butter for day-to-day activities and the relationships around the region. And it included countries like China, where we actually had an exercise program with the People's Liberation Army. Even when we're competing in other areas and in other categories, we had cooperation when it came to humanitarian assistance. So I suspect that the next iterations of that disaster management exercise and exchange between the U.S. Army forces in the Pacific and the People's Liberation Army may have a new characteristic to it. It may now be talking about pandemic disease response and the lessons learned. That will be part of the scenario, and each will learn from the other in ways that sometimes diplomacy can't achieve.
General Neller, what about you? You've worked closely with foreign militaries in training, combat, and maybe even in a crisis, a humanitarian disaster or natural disaster. How do you think that mil-to-mil relationships can help us in moments of crisis?
Well, I think I would align myself almost 100% with what Vince just said. Even though you represent your nation and your loyalty is to your country and your constitution and your family, there is a certain relationship you build with your foreign military partners because you have to trust each other. You have to build confidence in each other, particularly if there's a treaty and that you're going to be there to help them accomplish their mission, and you develop a personal relationship. And although that never trump their loyalty to their country, just like it won't trump yours, it allows you to have a different kind of conversation about what's going on, because in many cases you become personal friends. And so your ability to call somebody up and say, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? What can you tell me about this? And that they will give you some substantial response because they know that they trust that you'll be, particularly careful with the information, and you won't put them in a position where they've been compromised. So those relationships, which are developed over time, they take a lot of work, but they start at field training and exercises. And in many cases, they last a lifetime, even after you leave active service. So they're absolutely critical. And it's almost a different channel from which to get information. Just like I'm sure General Brooks, when he was U.S. Army Pacific, met all his Army counterparts throughout the Pacific. I've met with all the Marine Corps, Naval Infantry counterparts in the Pacific. When you're a component, you meet all the militaries in the particular region you're working. You get to meet people. You share information. If you do an exercise, usually there's some sort of social event where you get a chance to talk and know a little bit about each other's family. So those relationships grow and they build, and they provide a different means of communication and information, which is helpful to both countries.
All right, there's another issue that the COVID crisis has sort of brought to the forefront of our society, and that's a question of the role of experts in managing government response. And I think that senior commanders like both of you have valuable practical experience with this issue that we don't always take advantage of. As commanders, and as especially as senior commanders, both of you operated fundamentally as generalists. You were general officers. Your general staff, at least in the Army, general staff removes their specialty insignia so that they can be more representative of everybody, more representative of the mission of the unit rather than a particular subject matter field. Your orientation is the mission of the unit, whatever it might be. But you've had all kinds of specialists, subject matter experts working for you. They're medical experts, logistics experts, legal experts, the list goes on. Given your experience as executive generalists, what are your thoughts on striking a productive relationship between leaders who are generalists and subject matter experts and the collective mission orientation? And this time, General Neller, why don't we start with you?
Well, when you're in a large organization and you find yourself as a decision maker, commander, senior executive, however you want to describe it, you become very, I don't want to use the word dependent, but you have a requirement for information. And there's no way, because of the breadth and depth of the things that you have to understand or make decisions on, that you can be an expert in everything. So you have a medical officer, you have a lawyer, you have a comptroller, you have somebody to talk to you about contracting, you have somebody that gives you information about anything in particular that you might need to know about. You've got it in an operational sense, you've got logisticians, you've got strategic mobility people, on and on and on. And so you have to rely on them and you learn from them. That doesn't mean that you don't yourself that you don't have to develop a particular understanding, or at least a rudimentary understanding of these certain things. But there's no way you're going to have the depth and knowledge of every person on your staff. And I'll give you an example. I was the J3 in 2011, and in Japan they had the earthquake, tsunami, and then the disaster at the Fukushima nuclear reactor. They had 6 reactors, and 3 of them were not shut down, and they lost their ability to cool them. And so there was a big crisis because we had American citizens over there, and the Japanese government, albeit in some fits and starts, eventually asked us for some assistance. And so I would go to the briefing with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he would ask me about the status of the nuclear reactors. And so here I am, a Marine infantry officer, trying to explain to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs about nuclear reactors. And I finally found out that the Navy has actually a 4-star admiral in charge of nuclear power because of the nuclear reactors that the Navy has on ships. And the chairman, is talking to this guy. So clearly I'm at a distinct informational disadvantage. But then I realized I had a Navy captain on my ship who was a nuclear power officer. So I brought him to the brief so he could describe what was going on with a nuclear reactor, other than a Marine infantry officer. At the same time, I had him give me, so I could understand at least the majority of what he was saying to the chairman, a basic rudimentary discussion of how nuclear reactors work, what was wrong with the one in Fukushima. And so but I allowed him as the subject matter expert to brief this particular part of the briefing to the chairman, or to anybody else for that matter. So you are reliant on these people, and you have to trust them, and they have to work hard to make sure they get good information, and you make sure that this is disseminated up and down the chain of command. Because right now with the COVID thing, there's, you've seen it over the period of time. Well, we should do this. No, that's not true. No, we don't need to wear masks. No, maybe we should. And that's understandable. That's part of the learning and education that goes on with the situation. As we get more data, we learn more about something that we didn't have at least a huge amount of information. We knew about pandemics, but this particular virus, what it did, how it acts, And you've seen it, there's a responsibility to provide information so that people can be educated and understand why some of the decisions that are being made are made.
Great. That's a great example. General Brooks, what about you? What are your thoughts on an executive's use of experts?
Well, I think that any executive, be it a military executive, which is a commander or a director, any executive demonstrates wisdom when he or she recognizes that he or she does not have all the answers. This is wisdom. And the executive is the one who should be applying and creating the environment where wisdom can thrive. And that's why being open to the advice of the experts, seeking them out, having them close enough and accessible that they can give you the depth that you don't have yourself to make the best possible decisions. I found in complex circumstances, it didn't matter how much I knew. If I didn't know to ask somebody else, then I didn't know enough. And there was always someone who had more depth than I had in nearly every area, except for how to bring people together. I might have had more depth and experience in that, so that maybe is my expertise. But they had the expertise in some specific matter, some technical field, some scientific basis that I didn't know. And that is critically important in working through a complex problem. To do otherwise is to limit the amount of creativity and innovation in solving the complex problem. And I find that the more complex the problem, the more creativity and innovation is required. And that will not be done by the brightest person. That will be done by the combination of bright people who are given the opportunity to share what they understand. So I'm in strong favor of any leader who takes the time to listen and allows experts to communicate on their own, even if the experts have a dissenting view with where the executive wanted them to go. It's even more important. And so having this dissenting view adds depth and scope to the understanding of the problem. And it's critically important in a time like we're seeing now with COVID and any other crisis that anyone would experience.
Great. Well, great answers, helpful answers, both of you. Well, gentlemen, I'm sorry that that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, covering defense support to civilian authorities, a little bit of mill-to-mill relationships, and the use of experts as a generalist executive. All of these things have been worth our time today. Appreciate it. Thanks again to General Vincent Brooks and General Robert Neller, our Clements Center Distinguished Senior Fellows, for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.